The tugboat that was blown to pieces in our article was located at the Jute Mill dock. Jute is a rope-like material made from a plant of the same name, belonging to the hibiscus or mallow families, the Britannica tells us, while explaining that jute's fibers' primary use is in fabrics for packaging a wide range of agricultural and industrial commodities that require bags, sacks, packs, and wrappings, where bulky, strong fabrics and twines resistant to stretching are required. Jute is widely used because of its low cost. Burlap is made from jute. The Chelsea Jute Mill was located at the top of Greenpoint at Manhattan Avenue and had been there at least since 1882. A large labor strike occurred in 1886. This brief notice in the Times-Union perhaps says it all. 500 men, women, boys, and girls of the Chelsea Jute Mills are on strike. Small pay and rigid rules are said to be the cause. The Chelsea Jute Mill strikers met last night. It was said that large money donations were being received. The company had sent to Patterson for girls, but a committee of the strikers had thwarted them. The Bag Sewers Association sent word that they would sew no more bags for the company. Nicholas Mulvey, chairman of the committee, said he had organized a systematic boycott against the jute mills. For a fuller picture of the strike, we turn to the Standard Union. Saturday, December 16, 1893. They protest. Chelsea Jute Mill employees don't want the Wilson Bill. Big meeting in Greenpoint. Over 2,000 men, women, and children gather in the Greenpoint assembly rooms and listen to arguments as to why the new tariff bill should not become a law. Resolutions adopted. There was a great mass meeting in Greenpoint last night. There in the Greenpoint assembly rooms, Greenpoint Avenue near Manhattan, over 2,000 employees of the Chelsea Jute Mills and other Greenpoint factories gathered and listened for nearly 2 hours to arguments against the proposed Wilson tariff bill. The big hall was thrown open shortly before 8 o'clock. Long before that hour, the street in front of the hall was thronged with crowds of men, women, and children employed in the different Greenpoint factories, and especially in the Chelsea Jute Mills. The hall was filled in less than 10 minutes. Every seat was occupied, and many men and women held their grown-up children in their laps during the entire evening. Before the meeting was called to order, the band played Daisy Bell, and the pretty girls in the audience from the jute mills sang these words: Congress, Congress, give us your answer due. We're half crazy, all for the fear of you. 'Twill be a costly measure, and will rob us of much treasure. The Wilson bill, now please kill, and we'll pray real hard for you. The meeting was called to protest against the Wilson bill, and especially against the adoption of the jute, hemp, and flax schedules of the bill. The chief arguments advanced at the meeting were to the effect that if the present schedule, as proposed, should be adopted, it would certainly result in the closing of the Chelsea Jute Mills, and if not, a big reduction in wages. All the employees were urged to ask their congressmen to work and vote against the bill. Sunday, April 18, 1886, the New York Times. The Jute Mill strike. Charges of intimidation and insulting conduct made by both sides. The superintendent of the Chelsea Jute Mills said yesterday that nearly 70 operators had been obtained through advertisements and enough strikers had returned to work to increase the running force to about 3/5 its usual strength. The majority of those on strike, he said, were not skilled laborers, and he thought that all would be willing to return if they could do so as union members, and if they could secure the discharge of all non-union employees. He also said the striking girls had made a practice of lounging around the building and of intimidating those who desired to return to work and of fighting with those at work whenever they came outside. At the headquarters of the strikers at 10th Avenue and 30th Street, it was claimed that nearly all those on strike were skilled in their departments of work and had long been in the service of the company. Nicholas Mulry of the Central Labor Union, who has charge of the strike, positively denied that the girls had made any disturbance on the streets or in the vicinity of the mills. As for the arrests made by the police, he claimed that they were ordered by Mr. Leal or his superintendent, Mr. Griffin, who had failed to substantiate the charges when the cases were tried in the Jefferson Market Police Court. He claimed that insults had come from the other side and that when any of the striking girls passed the mills, they were called insulting names and that missiles were thrown at them, apparently with the sanction of those in charge at the mills. John F. Fallon of number 517 West 24th Street, who called David McLean a scab, was fined $10 by Justice Duffy yesterday, but was finally let off on the payment of $5. Evelyn and Mary Week, who were charged with having insulted Emma Lors, one of 5 sisters who remains at work in the mill, were bound in their own recognizance to keep the peace for 6 months. 2 years later, the Brooklyn Citizen was reporting on the labor groups in the mills. Wednesday, July 24, 1895, Jute Mills jealousies. They led to a rip-roaring, red-hot time last night. There are several thousand men, boys, and girls employed in the Chelsea jute mills at Manhattan Avenue and Newtown Creek, and they are divided in 2 factions, the Far Downs and the Connaught men. Dan McMahon is the champion of the former, while Jim Quinn is the leader of the opposing host. Both of the young men are about 23 years old and tip the scales in the neighborhood of 133 pounds. The factions are wont to run first grand annual picnics with special prizes for ladies at the various spieling parks, and much jealousy exists in the shop. If one faction gets up a gaudily tinseled order of dance in crimson and blue and green, the other faction is bound to have rosettes and badges that will knock 'em out of sight. And so it came yesterday that the rivalry centered itself in a baseball match on Flood's lot on the corner of Messerol Avenue and Guernsey Street, a classic neighborhood where willy goats abound and little pigs root in the mud. All the dear little chippy girls were there, dressed in their best Sunday clothes, for work was slack in the jute mills, and even if it wasn't, they didn't care. They were out for fun, and they were going to have it for fair. See? 2 kegs of the best beer brewed in the burg were the trophies, and for several days the contestants that were to be had trained on Newtown Creek muriatic acid. One of the kegs was placed on first base, the other on third. It was when the batters began scurrying across the tin can-laden diamond, without noticing second base, however, that the trouble commenced. After 3 or 4 of the athletic ones had been knocked out with bats, baseball and otherwise, much to the glee of the onlookers, it was thought desirable to have the leaders of the faction settle the question of supremacy between themselves. This proposition was just as agreeable to Mr. Quinn as it was to Mr. McMahon, so when the shady eyes of night started to close in, all hands repaired to the Java Street dock. It was really a merry gathering. After stripping to almost living picture nudity, Mr. Quinn and Mr. McMahon squared off at each other in the regulation way, and for a moment one could almost hear the tide flow, so intense was the intensity of their admirers. In a moment, however, This stillness of the still was rudely dissipated by a whirl of biting, gouging, and punching that would make a Mexican bullfight sneak off and kick itself. Miss Annie Quinn, Joe is not her beau, but her brother, thought it time to take a hand in, and the way she did pull hair was a caution. Mr. McMahon was forced to desist and was declared defeated, but he and his partisans say the festivities will be resumed ere a fortnight. Long live the jute mills, even if they were short-handed today. In 1898, another fire at the mill caused more havoc for its workers, this article noting that many of the employees are girls whose wages are their only means of support. For a wonderful book about the life of a mill girl, see Call the Darkness Light by Nancy Zeroulis, about a girl from the Lowell Mills in Massachusetts. Wednesday, July 20, 1898, the Boston Evening Transcript. Large jute mills burned. Over 1,000 employees of the Chelsea Company of New York thrown out of work. New York, July 20, more than 1,000 employees of the Chelsea Jute Mills in Greenpoint were thrown out of work by a fire which broke out in the factory today. Many of the employees are girls whose wages are their only means of support. The mills occupy a huge 8-story brick building at Manhattan Avenue, Ash Street, and Newtown Creek, and cover nearly an entire block. They are among the largest in the country. The upper floors of the main building are used as a warehouse for the raw jute, the lower being filled with machinery. The fire was practically confined to the 7th and 8th floors of the building. The lower floors, however, were badly damaged by water, and the machinery was almost ruined. This was very valuable, and its loss will form a large factor in the damage by the fire. The jute stored in the 7th floor, valued at $15,000, was destroyed. The damage to the building and the rest of the stock is estimated at $10,000, while the total loss will probably be a little less than $50,000. The damage is such that the mills will have to shut down for some time. The cause of the fire is unknown. In 1967, a letter to the editor appeared in the Daily News from a George Reicholt, who worked in the Chelsea Jute Mills at the age of 14 in 1902. It was a 6-day week, he writes. For $5 a week, I thought I was rich. Reicholt is writing in response to a previous letter from someone who had worked at the pencil factory in Greenpoint at $9 a week and had the gall to think it wasn't enough.